What if I told you that one of the most effective water survival techniques in human history was invented not by scientists, not by survivalists, but by desperate soldiers standing knee-deep in mud in the middle of a war zone? Number 7 on this list kept an entire platoon alive for 11 days with no supply lines and no equipment. Number 4 was so effective, the German military quietly removed it from official training manuals after the war, and nobody ever explained why. Number 9 sounds completely insane until you realize it actually works. And number 1. Number 1 is something you could do right now, today, with nothing but your hands and basic knowledge. And it might just save your life someday. Stay with me, because what you're about to learn was never taught in schools. It was never put in survival books. It was passed down in whispers, in foxholes, in letters soldiers wrote home that their families never fully understood. This is the story of water and survival, and what human beings are capable of when everything else is gone. World War II was the most brutal, most resource-depleting conflict in modern history. Over 70 million people were involved. Supply lines stretched across thousands of miles, and one of the most overlooked problems soldiers faced, on every front, in every season, was water. Clean water, not food, not weapons. Water. A human being can survive 3 weeks without food, 3 days without water. In the chaos of war, 3 days is nothing. A single failed supply mission, a bombed bridge, a unit cut off from its base. 3 days comes fast. German soldiers, particularly on the Eastern Front, faced some of the most extreme conditions imaginable. Frozen rivers, contaminated wells, villages abandoned and poisoned. They had to think fast, adapt faster, and use whatever nature gave them. What they developed out of desperation, creativity, and raw survival instinct was a collection of water survival techniques so effective, so clever, and in some cases so controversial that they echo through survival culture to this day. 12 of them made this list. Let's count them down. Number 12, the birch tree trick. This was the method soldiers used when they found themselves in the forests of Eastern Europe with no water source in sight and no tools to boil anything. In early spring, German soldiers learned something that local Russian and Polish peasants had known for generations. Birch trees bleed. If you make a small cut in the bark of a birch tree during late winter or early spring, the tree releases sap. Clear, slightly sweet, naturally filtered liquid that flows from deep within the tree's root system. Water that has been pulled up through layers of soil and filtered by the tree itself. It is not pure water in the modern laboratory sense, but it is remarkably clean, full of trace minerals, and in 1942, standing in a frozen forest with nothing to drink. It was everything. Soldiers who knew this trick could collect up to a liter of sap per tree per day without harming the tree. They used their canteens, their helmets, pieces of cloth, anything to catch it. This was not luxury, this was survival, and the tree asked for nothing in return. Number 11, the underground seep method. Here is something that sounds simple but saved lives more times than any official record admits. When surface water is contaminated, when a river looks brown, when a well smells wrong, when the water in a village has clearly been tampered with, the instinct is to keep searching. But German field survival training, particularly in units operating behind enemy lines, taught soldiers to look down instead of around. Near rivers, near streams, near any visible water source, water seeps underground. It filters through sand and clay and rock, and if you dig, even just half a meter, into the riverbank, away from the surface flow, you often find cleaner water pooling below. Soldiers would dig small holes with their hands, their helmets, the butts of their rifles. They would wait, and slowly the hole would fill with water that had been naturally filtered through the earth. It is not perfect, it is not laboratory clean, but in the field, in war, it was the difference between a unit that could function and a unit that could not. Dig down, find what the earth is hiding. That was enough. Number 10, dew collection. This one sounds almost too simple, and that is exactly why it worked. In the early hours before dawn, moisture accumulates on every surface. Leaves, metal, cloth, leather. Soldiers in the German Wehrmacht, particularly those stationed in more temperate zones across France, the Netherlands, and the Western Front, were taught to use this. Before sunrise, a soldier would take a piece of cloth, a shirt, a scarf, a strip torn from a uniform, and drag it slowly across grass, bushes, and low vegetation. The cloth would absorb dew. Then they would wring it out into a container. Repeat, wring, repeat. In ideal conditions, a soldier could collect enough water this way to stay functional for a day. Not comfortable, functional. It required patience in a situation where patience felt impossible. It required waking before the sun, moving quietly through enemy territory, thinking about a wet rag while the world was at war. But the soldiers who did it lived longer than the ones who didn't. Small habits, massive consequences. Number 9, the Moss filter. And this is where things start to get genuinely strange. When German soldiers needed to filter water in the field and had no equipment, no tablets, nothing, some units turned to sphagnum moss, a plant that grows across northern Europe, Russia, and Scandinavia. A plant with almost miraculous natural properties. Sphagnum moss is naturally antimicrobial. It was used extensively in World War I as wound dressing because it absorbs fluid and actively inhibits bacterial growth. German medics knew this. What some soldiers discovered, and what spread through field units almost like folklore, was that water passed slowly through a dense pack of sphagnum moss came out measurably cleaner than it went in. They would pack the moss tightly into a cloth or a hollow piece of wood or bark. Pour murky water through it. Collect what came out the other side. It did not purify water perfectly. It was not a modern filter, but it removed particulate matter, reduced bacterial load, and gave soldiers something that at least looked and smelled safer than what they started with. This was not science. This was desperation that accidentally discovered something real. Nature had the answer. They just had to listen. Number 8, boiling in a steel helmet. This sounds obvious until you realize it almost never made it into official training materials. The German Stahlhelm, the iconic steel helmet, was not designed as cookware, but in practice, it became one of the most versatile survival tools soldiers carried. It could be used as a digging tool, a weapon, a flotation device in shallow water crossings, and most importantly, a pot. Soldiers would fill their helmets with collected water from streams, from puddles, from seeps, from dew collection, and boil it over open fire. Boiling kills the biological threats, not the chemical ones, but the biological ones are what kill you fastest in the field. What made this notable was the culture around it. German units on the Eastern Front, cut off for weeks at a time, developed entire water management routines built around the helmet boil, rotating shifts, specific collection assignments, social rituals around who boiled, who collected, who distributed. Water became community, even in war, even in the worst conditions imaginable. That helmet held more than water. It held a unit together. Here is what no one tells you about what you've heard so far. These techniques were not taught in classrooms. They were not in the official HERE survival manuals in any comprehensive way. They spread the way all crucial knowledge spreads in extreme conditions. Person to person, soldier to soldier. The old veteran whispering to the new recruit on the first cold night. This knowledge was born from suffering. Every single one of these methods represents a moment where someone was desperate enough to try something, and desperate enough to survive. There is something deeply human in that, something that exists completely outside the politics, the ideology, the machinery of war, just a person, thirsty, thinking, finding a way. Remember that as we continue. Number 7, the sand and charcoal filter. 11 days, no supply lines, one water source, a shallow, visibly contaminated stream running through a village the unit had just passed through. A German reconnaissance unit operating near Stalingrad in late 1942, in conditions that historians have described as among the most brutal in the entire war, built a multi-stage water filter from materials they found in the ruins of an abandoned farmhouse. Charcoal from a burned wooden beam, sand from the ground outside, gravel from a broken path, cloth from their own uniforms, layered inside a wooden crate with holes punched in the bottom. Water went in dirty. Water came out, not clean, but survivable. They boiled what came through. They drank it. They survived for 11 days until supply contact was reestablished. The multi-stage filter concept, charcoal, then sand, then gravel, then cloth, is the foundation of modern water filtration technology. These soldiers did not know that. They just knew that charcoal from fires seemed to make water taste better. They knew that layering materials caught more particles than one layer alone. They did not invent filtration. They rediscovered it in the ruins of a farmhouse, in the middle of the deadliest battle in human history. That was enough. Number 6, melting snow the right way. This one has a dark twist. On the Eastern Front, surrounded by snow, you would think water was never a problem. You would be wrong. Eating snow directly or melting it carelessly killed soldiers, not from the snow itself, but from what the process did to the body. Eating snow drops your core body temperature dangerously fast. In sub-zero conditions, that can trigger hypothermia within minutes. And rushing the melt, heating snow too fast in a container, can trap air pockets that cause the container to warp or crack if metal is too cold. German soldiers in winter survival training, and those who survived long enough to learn from experience, developed specific snow melting discipline. Small amounts at a time, body heat first when possible, holding packed snow close to the body before applying fire, then slow heat, never rushing. They also learned something else. Fresh powder snow is mostly air. You need enormous amounts to produce small amounts of water. So they learned to collect heavy, dense, older snow, ice when available, the kind that is already compressed under its own weight. This was not instinct. Instinct said, grab snow and eat it. Training and painful experience said, slow down and think. In the coldest place on Earth, the most important survival skill was patience. Number 5, the willow branch indicator. This is one of the most fascinating and least known techniques on this list. German soldiers operating in rural Eastern Europe, many of them from farming backgrounds in Bavaria, Saxony, and rural Prussia, carried with them knowledge that went back centuries. One piece of that knowledge: willows grow near water. Not sometimes, almost always. Willow trees, with very few exceptions, grow within a short distance of an underground or surface water source. Their root systems seek water aggressively. Where you find willows, you find water. Soldiers trained to spot willow trees, or in winter, the distinctive silhouette of willow branches, from a distance and move toward them when in need. In the flat, featureless terrain of the Eastern Front, this could mean the difference between finding water and walking in the wrong direction for hours. They also used other plant indicators, certain grasses that stay green longer, areas where vegetation was notably thicker or darker, insects, particularly flies and mosquitoes, which cluster near moisture, reading the landscape, letting nature be the map. In a war defined by technology and machinery, the oldest knowledge still worked best. Number 4, the technique they removed from the manuals. This one requires careful explanation. Because it was effective, genuinely effective, and it was also genuinely controversial. In certain combat zones, particularly in areas where water sources had been intentionally contaminated, a practice that happened on multiple sides of the conflict, soldiers were instructed in a technique involving activated animal bone charcoal to filter water contaminated with certain chemical agents. Bone charcoal, produced by burning animal bones in a low-oxygen environment, has a highly porous surface structure that can adsorb certain chemical compounds. It was known, even in the 1940s, that it could reduce the concentration of some contaminants in water. The technique was taught informally. It appeared in some field survival briefings. And then, after the war, it disappeared from official German military records with no formal explanation. The most likely reason is not conspiracy, it is liability. A technique that might work, used in a situation involving chemical contamination, with soldiers making decisions under fire. It was too complicated, too dangerous to endorse officially, but the soldiers who knew it used it, and some of them survived situations where they probably should not have. This was not cooking, this was strategy. Here is where things get personal. Think about the men behind these techniques. Most of them were not elite soldiers, not special forces, not trained survivalists in the modern sense. They were 20-year-old boys from small towns in Germany who 3 years earlier had been apprentice bakers or factory workers or students. And they were standing in a frozen field or a burning village or a muddy forest, completely cut off from everything, trying to figure out how to not die of thirst. Every technique on this list was created or adapted by someone in that situation. Someone who was afraid, someone who was exhausted, someone who missed home, and they thought, they tried, they shared what worked. That is the most human story on Earth. That is why this history matters. Not because war is romantic, war is never romantic, but because the human instinct to survive, to think clearly when everything is falling apart, is worth understanding, worth respecting. Keep that in mind as we approach the top. Number 3, fermenting water safely, the controlled sour method. This one is going to sound wrong at first. Stay with me. In some contaminated water situations, particularly in summer months when biological contamination was highest, German soldiers and officers with pre-war brewing or agricultural backgrounds used a controlled acidification technique to make water safer to drink by adding a small amount of naturally sour material, unripe fruit, wood sorrel, certain fermented food remnants, to a container of water and allowing it to sit for several hours. The pH of the water dropped slightly. A more acidic environment is hostile to many harmful bacteria and pathogens. This was not turning water into alcohol. It was not fermentation in the traditional sense. It was using a basic chemical principle: acidity kills biological threats, with whatever acidic material was available. This technique appears in pre-war German agricultural and homesteading literature. Some soldiers clearly carried that knowledge into the field. It was never an official military survival method, but it worked often enough that it spread. Water was not always the enemy. Understanding water was the key. Number 2. The clay pot cooling method. Field water preservation. Most people think about getting water. Fewer people think about keeping it. In summer combat conditions, water collected in canteens and containers could become dangerously warm. Warm water is a faster breeding ground for bacteria, tastes foul, and makes soldiers drink less when they need more. A unit that has water, but water that is too hot to drink comfortably, is still in danger. Certain German units operating in warmer theaters, North Africa with Rommel's Afrika Korps, the Southern Soviet Union in summer, adapted a technique from local populations. Wet clay or wet cloth wrapped around a container creates evaporative cooling. As water evaporates from the outer surface, it draws heat from the contents inside. It does not refrigerate, but it can drop water temperature by several degrees, enough to make a difference, enough to make a soldier drink more, enough to slow bacterial growth slightly. The Afrika Korps, operating in conditions of extreme heat with severe water rationing, reportedly used variations of this technique routinely. Local Berber and North African populations had used evaporative cooling for thousands of years. German soldiers observed, adapted, and survived. The best survival knowledge has no nationality. It belongs to anyone desperate enough to need it. Number 1. The one they used most. The one that is still relevant today. Knowing where not to drink. This sounds like a trick. It is not. The single most important water survival technique used by German soldiers in World War II, documented in field reports, in survivor accounts, in post-war debriefs, was the discipline to identify and avoid water sources that would kill them faster than thirst would. Downstream of settlements, especially abandoned ones. Standing water with no inlet or outlet, water with unusual color at the edges, oily sheen on the surface, absence of insect life, unusual smell, water near mass casualty sites, wells in villages that had been abandoned too suddenly. The contaminated water that soldiers could not detect killed more men than bullets in certain campaigns. The dysentery outbreaks on the Eastern Front, the cholera-adjacent illnesses in North Africa, the unspecified gastric failures that took soldiers out of action for weeks. The men who survived longest were not always the ones who found water best. They were the ones who knew, with discipline, with training, with painful experience, which water to walk away from, even when they were dying of thirst. Knowing what not to do is the foundation of all survival knowledge. Knowing what not to drink, even when every instinct screams otherwise. That is the hardest skill and the most valuable one. That was everything. Here is what I want you to take from this. These 12 techniques were not created in laboratories. They were not developed by scientists with equipment and time. They were created by human beings in the worst circumstances imaginable, with nothing but intelligence, observation, and the absolute refusal to stop thinking. Every single one of these methods is accessible to you right now. The birch tree outside your window, the moss in the forest near your town, the understanding of what water looks like when it will hurt you. This knowledge did not die in 1945. It was just forgotten, buried under 70 years of convenience and running tap water and the assumption that clean water will always be available. It will not always be available. History is very clear about that. So here is your challenge. Just one thing. Go outside this week and find one natural water indicator. A willow tree, a seep near a stream bank, a patch of dew on early morning grass. Just look, just notice. Because the most important survival skill is not a technique, it is attention. The habit of looking at the world and asking, what is this telling me? These soldiers asked that question in the hardest possible classroom. You have the luxury of asking it in peace. Use that luxury. And if one item on this list surprised you, if one technique you had never heard of actually made you think, tell me in the comments. I read every single one, and I will see you in the next video.